Hello and welcome, friends. It's your boy Sultan Skinny, vizier of all that's lean and politically unclean. At the height of their power and influence, the Islamic world took one of the biggest L's of their civilization's history. In 1099 CE, Crusader knights from Christian Europe had captured the city of Jerusalem, the third holiest site of the Islamic faith. The siege resulted in an absolute massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, a bloodbath so brutal that the Crusader Chronicle Gesta Francorum would document that the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. The loss of the Holy City, along with most of the Levantian coast, was definitely a major blow to the Islamic world, but to the Muslims, the foreign crusaders were actually the least of their problems. The Crusaders were violent barbarians that just seized some of the most important territory in the region, yes, but the biggest threat to the Islamic world was in fact other Muslims. Prior to the Crusades, Jerusalem and much of the Levant was already a place of contention between the Sunni Abbasids and the Shiite Fatimids, two rival Islamic empires battling to declare their dynasty as the true successors of the Prophet Muhammad. This competition over the title of Caliph was exhausting the two imperial powers, leaving them vulnerable to the less advanced Europeans who were now united under the guise of defeating their common Muslim enemies. With the Islamic world divided and the third holiest city of Islam under the rule of foreign fighters, the Muslims were experiencing a dark chapter in their history. But in the late 10th century, a hero would emerge among the Muslims, one that would not only defeat the foreign crusaders and recapture the holy city of Jerusalem, but also restore unity within the Ummah. A man whose legacy was so impactful to the Middle East and the medieval world that his name would be honored with respect and praise by even his most bitter of rivals. Born in the Iraqi city of Tikrit in 1137 CE, Yusuf ibn Ayyub was raised by an influential Kurdish family. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was the governor of Tikrit, and his uncle Shirkuh was a military commander of the Zengid Emirate, a Turkish dynasty that ruled much of what is now Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and northern Arabia. Yusuf spent most of his early life in Damascus, where his father and uncle were stationed. Although mostly being under the wing of his uncle who taught him the art of warfare, Yusuf was far more interested in studying religion and philosophy, adopting the laqab Salahuddin, righteous of the faith. But any good Islamic laqab needs a westernized version of the name, and in Salah ad-Din's case, he would forever be remembered as Saladin. Despite being more interested in studying the Quran and memorizing poetry, Saladin would find himself serving in the Zengid military, fighting against rival Islamic emirates and the Crusader colonies. The events of the First Crusade completely altered the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, with a number of small Crusader kingdoms being established along the Levant. The first Zengid emir, Imad al-Din Zeng, captured the county of Edessa in 1144 CE, which would be the catalyst for the Second Crusade. Zengid's son and successor, Nur ad-Din, would successfully defeat the Crusaders in Damascus, which he later made his capital city. This defeat would send shockwaves to the Crusader states as they were dealing with their own internal disputes. However, an opportunity to conquer more land came when the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt began to experience its own political crisis. In 1163 CE, Shawar ibn Mujir al-Sadi, the vizier of the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid, was ousted by a rival vizier by the name of al-Dirham. To get back his position as the second most powerful man of the Fatimid Empire, Shawar asked Nur ad-Din for military assistance in overthrowing al-Dirham. Nur ad-Din accepted this plea for help, sending his commander Shirkuh and his nephew Saladin with an army to overthrow the vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate. Together, Saladin and his uncle would successfully reinstate Shawar as the vizier, and al-Dirham would be killed in the process. Now that he was reinstated, Shawar asked Shirkuh and his army to leave Egypt in exchange for 30,000 gold dinars. But Shirkuh refused, saying that his army would stay for as long as his emir, Nur ad-Din, desired. The presence of Shirkuh's army worried Shawar of another coup, so he asked the king of Jerusalem, Al-Malik, to help kick out the Syrian army. Together, the Egyptian and Crusader armies would attempt to kick out Shirkuh and his forces by attacking their stronghold in the city of Bilbis. The siege failed, but Shirkuh agreed with Al-Malik that the two armies would leave Egypt with Shawar in charge. However, Shirkuh and his army would return just a few years later, with Al-Malik being called upon the Egyptians to aid them in their fight again. While the Crusaders were unable to defeat Shirkuh or make any real territorial gains, they were able to profit from the large tributes that Shawar kept paying them. The payment and close ties to the Crusaders was not a very popular thing to the Egyptian public, as they not only saw this as their government in bed with the enemy, but it also meant a raise in taxes. As Shawar's popularity in the public and his court officials were diminishing, many of the Caliphate's courts were seeing Nur ad-Din as the lesser of two evils. This political shift worried the Crusaders, who had been making tribute off of Shawar's alliance. With the help of the Byzantine army and navy, Al-Malik would once again invade Egypt in 1168 CE, sacking the city of Bilbis and indiscriminately massacring its population, including the Christian Coptics who supported them. The massacre led to the Crusaders losing public support from the Egyptian people and government, leading to Shawar once again asking Shirkuh for military assistance. But this time, when Shirkuh arrived in Cairo in 1169 CE, he executed Shawar and declared himself as the new vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate. However, Shirkuh's reign would only last for a few months, with him dying from health complications due to his excessive eating. The Caliph Al-Adid would then personally appoint Saladin to rule as the vizier of Egypt. Why Saladin was chosen as the vizier remains a bit of a mystery, but his sudden promotion of being the second highest official in Egypt came with difficulties. Many in Egypt were opposed to Saladin being vizier, with assassination and coup attempts being very common in the early days of his career. Although these attempts were quashed, Saladin also had the problem of maintaining loyalty between the Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid and the Zengid Emir Nur al-Din. The Fatimids prided themselves in being a Shiite caliphate, but the Zengids were Sunni, with Nur al-Din becoming ever more friendly with the Abbasid Caliph based in Baghdad. Saladin thus needed to balance his priorities and maintain loyalty with both rulers, something that would prove useful against the Crusaders. In 1169, a large Crusader army with the help of the Byzantine navy attempted to take the Egyptian city of Damietta. Saladin was able to hold off the siege, and with Nur al-Din's reinforcements, completely repelled the Crusader invasion. After the success of defending Damietta, Saladin was becoming increasingly popular in Egypt. While he was strengthening the Fatimid Empire's domain, Saladin and Nur al-Din planned to reinstate the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustadi as the legitimate Caliph of Egypt. Saladin consolidated his power in the courts, placing family members in positions of power and deposing the old emirs. In 1171 CE, Al-Adid fell ill and died, leaving Saladin in control of the empire's destiny. Saladin would then become the Sultan of Egypt and announce his empire's loyalty to the Abbasid Caliph, effectively ending the Shiite Fatimid Empire and ushering in the beginning of the Ayyubid dynasty. During his early years as Sultan, Saladin expanded Egypt's power. He quashed the Nubian forces that maintained their loyalty to the Fatimid dynasty, captured Crusader castles and strongholds in Kerak, Montreal, and Tripoli, and even managed to conquer the Hejaz and Yemen, holding the two holiest sites in Islam. Saladin was quickly becoming a household name across the region, which was beginning to worry his old master Nur al-Din in Syria. Nur al-Din and his allied emirs were actually plotting to overthrow Saladin and take full control of the new empire he was beginning to build. But in 1174 CE, Nur al-Din fell ill and died, leaving his 11-year-old son As-Salih Ismaili al-Malik in charge of his domain. Saladin wrote a letter to the young emir, sending his condolences about his father, who he had respected as a teacher and leader. Although he could now invade Syria as it was weakened after the death of Nur al-Din, Saladin thought it would be un-Islamic of him to do so, as it was the land of his former master. For the sake of his image as a pious and noble leader, Saladin waited for an invitation from As-Salih to aid him in the inevitable instability of his domain. Saladin knew that the young emir would eventually be taken advantage of by other Zengid emirs, so he patiently waited to be called for help. This plea from As-Salih came when one of his emirs ousted him from the city of Aleppo. By 1175 CE, Saladin was able to capture most of the major cities of Syria, all while still technically pledging allegiance to As-Salih, proclaiming himself as the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, uniting the two territories under his rule. Although unable to conquer the city of Aleppo, Saladin managed to secure an alliance with the emirs who recognized his authority as the king of Syria. Throughout his campaign in Syria, Saladin had two major thorns at his side: the Crusaders, who were constantly raiding and taking advantage of Muslim infighting, and the legendary Nizari assassins, who struck fear into the heart of Saladin after several attempts at his life. The assassins had fortresses across the region, all on mountaintop. The position of these fortresses proved difficult for Saladin to capture, so instead of fighting them to the end, he actually brokered a truce and an alliance with the assassins. The Crusaders would remain in the back of Saladin's mind, but he was actually more concerned about consolidating his power and alliances in Muslim-held territory. In the early 1180s, Saladin would expand his rule to Mesopotamia and the rest of Syria, conquering the city of Mosul, Raqqa, and Aleppo. Saladin would also establish an alliance with both the Byzantine Empire and the Sultanate of Rome, which was the last remaining semblance of the once grand Seljuk Empire. With his territory and alliances secured, Saladin was now able to focus his attention towards the Crusader states, of which he had now surrounded. While Saladin managed to unify his territories and establish reliable allies, the Crusader states were facing their own disunity and political complications. In 1185, Baldwin IV died, succumbing to his illness, leaving his 9-year-old nephew Baldwin V as king of Jerusalem. The child king would die the following year, as he too was very sickly. His death led to a succession crisis in the kingdom, with his mother Sibilla and aunt Isabella competing to put their husbands on the throne. It was eventually decided that Guy de Lusignan, husband of Sibilla, be crowned the king of Jerusalem. One of Guy's closest allies was Reynaud of Chatillon, a lord in the kingdom of Jerusalem. Although being a strong ally during the succession crisis, Reynaud would actually prove to be the downfall of Guy's reign, as he personally led an army to loot a Muslim pilgrimage caravan. The raid broke a truce that Saladin had signed with Baldwin a few years prior, and had the Sultan vowing revenge. In the summer of 1187, Saladin led his army to take the city of Tiberias, knowing that the king would need to send an army to aid the fortress. Although initially advised not to provoke Saladin, Guy marched a large army alongside his friend Reynaud and Raymond of Tripoli, unknowingly falling into Saladin's trap. The heat of the Levantian sun and Saladin's archers' constant harassments demoralized the Crusader army, who were suffering from thirst. They headed towards the spring of Hattin to camp, but Saladin's forces were already there, and within a day the Muslims annihilated the Crusader army, capturing 1,000 knights and the king and lords of Jerusalem. Famously, Saladin called forth Guy and Reynaud, granting the king a chalice of iced water, assuring that he would be spared. But when Guy offered to share the chalice with his close friend Reynaud, Saladin snatched the chalice back, making it very clear that he gave the cup to Guy and not Reynaud. Saladin had a personal vendetta against Reynaud, as he was the one who broke the truce between his empire and the Crusaders. So he offered him an ultimatum: convert to Islam or be executed. Reynaud refused to give up his faith, with Saladin personally executing him in front of Guy. Seeing that the king was in fear of his life, Saladin assured Guy that he would be spared, telling him that kings do not kill kings. Word of Saladin's decisive victory at Hattin spread throughout the medieval world, as he had single-handedly wiped out the majority of the Crusader army and captured their most prestigious leaders. Most of the cities in the kingdom would surrender to Saladin's forces, as they not only had no one to defend them, but also because of the Sultan's generous terms, as he allowed the Christians to keep their property without harassment. One by one, each city of the kingdom was captured, but Jerusalem remained the prize, one that was not going out without a fight. One of the nobles who managed to escape Hattin with their men was Balian of Ibelin. He had asked permission from Saladin to allow his wife and children to pass through Muslim lines away from Jerusalem, which was awaiting a siege. Saladin honored the deal under the conditions that Balian leave Jerusalem and try not to fight the siege. Balian ended up not honoring his end of the bargain, and instead became the commander of Jerusalem's defenses. Despite the broken promise, Saladin remained true to his word and allowed Balian's wife and children to leave Jerusalem unharmed. Saladin and his army would then lay siege to Jerusalem, forcing Balian to surrender. Unlike the Crusaders, who took the city in 1099, Saladin's capture of Jerusalem had no civilian casualties, and the Sultan kept his word in treating the occupied population well. He even summoned the Coptic Christian and Jewish population of his empire to come to the city and resettle, as they had previously been displaced by the Crusaders. Saladin's victory at Hattin and Jerusalem was monumental, having captured nearly all of the Crusader kingdom's territory with the exception of Tyre. Tyre was the most strategically important city that the Crusaders had, but Saladin focused most of his attention in capturing Jerusalem due to the symbolic significance. The news of the Muslim takeover of Jerusalem would reach Europe, in which a third crusade was initiated, being led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip II of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. Barbarossa was to reach Jerusalem by land, while Philip and Richard went by sea. But Barbarossa would die before reaching Ayyubid territory, falling off his horse and drowning in a river due to the weight of his own armor. The fleet of Philip and Richard would land on the coastal city of Acre, where Guy de Lusignan, who had been spared and released by Saladin, was attacking the Muslim-held city. The reinforcements of Philip and Richard's knights and navy helped the Christians take back the city from Saladin. After the capture of Acre, King Philip returned to France with the one victory being enough for him, leaving Richard in total control of the Crusader army. With his army of crusading knights, Richard would prove to be a major challenge for Saladin, defeating the Sultan at the Battle of Arsuf and taking the port city of Jaffa. Being only a few miles away from Jerusalem, Richard and his men were ready to take Jerusalem, but the consequences of taking the city worried Richard, as he knew his forces couldn't withstand a counter-siege. It was decided that the two sides begin negotiations, with Saladin sending his brother Al-Adil as his representative. Al-Adil was a really charismatic and charming guy, who actually reformed the perception the Crusaders had of Saladin. Al-Adil would remind the Crusaders of Saladin's benevolence towards his foes, his immense generosity, and that under his rule, Christians, Jews, and Muslims prayed peacefully, side by side. Richard personally took such a liking to Al-Adil that he even suggested that he get married to his sister and that the two be crowned the royals of Jerusalem. This option was actually considered, but it would require that Al-Adil convert to Christianity, which he ultimately refused. With the initial failure of the negotiations, Saladin marched his army to retake the city of Jaffa. Though successful in taking the city, Saladin lost control of his army, who were slaughtering the Crusaders as an act of revenge for the massacre they committed in Acre. However, Saladin would not have it and actually encouraged the Christians to hide in the citadel until he could regain control of his army. But luckily for the Crusaders, Richard came to the rescue with reinforcements, attacking the city by sea and once again securing the city. This defeat at the hand of the Crusaders forced Saladin to once again re-enter negotiations with Richard. In 1192 CE, the two monarchs signed the Treaty of Jaffa, establishing that Jerusalem would remain under the control of Saladin and that unarmed Christian pilgrims and merchants be allowed to enter the city. The Crusaders would keep most of the coastal territory they had conquered and have a truce with the Ayyubid Empire. Both sides felt dissatisfied with the results. The Crusaders had failed to take Jerusalem, which was the whole point of their campaign, and Saladin had failed to drive out all of the Crusader kingdoms. Despite the disappointment in the stalemate, Richard and Saladin would end up having a tremendous amount of respect for one another, with Saladin's reputation in Europe being one of an honorable and chivalrous leader. In his empire, Saladin was hailed as a hero, protecting the three holiest cities of Islam and bringing prosperity to his domain, which at its height encompassed Egypt, most of the Levant, Syria, Iraq, the Hejaz, and Yemen. In 1193 CE, a year after the Treaty of Jaffa, Saladin died of an illness. When his family opened his personal savings, they found that the Sultan didn't even have enough money to pay for his funeral service. He had spent almost all of what he had to his people, showering them with the spoils of conquests and even the gifts that Richard had sent him. Although the Ayyubid dynasty would not even last a century, eventually being overthrown by its Mamluk armies in 1260, Saladin's legacy would go on for a millennia, being remembered as a benevolent, charismatic, generous, and noble ruler. Saladin would be revered by his subjects and enemies as one of history's greatest leaders. While most of what we talked about was Saladin's conquests, he actually isn't so much remembered for his generalship as he was for his diplomacy. He united the Muslim emirs of Egypt and Syria through gifts and negotiations more so than combat. He even made allies with Christian states to accompany him in his conflict against the Christian Crusaders. Though not always winning his battles, Saladin won all of his wars through patience and diplomacy. While the Third Crusade resulted in a lukewarm stalemate for both Saladin and Richard, the aftermath of the treaty actually proved to be quite beneficial for both sides, despite the initial disappointments. After the Treaty of Jaffa, the Ayyubid Empire developed very strong trade relations with the Crusader states and other European kingdoms. The lucrative trade of goods and access to European markets ushered in an age of prosperity for the Ayyubids, but it was in fact Europe that benefited the most from this trade, with many new food products like apricots, lemons, ginger, and shallots being introduced to the continent. The Europeans also developed a taste for Islamic fashion accessories like carpets, ceramics, and glassware that were highly prized in marketplaces. In fact, it is from this lucrative trade relationship established by the Ayyubids and Crusader states that would allow for the Genoese and Venetian merchants to become so influential in Mediterranean seafaring and trade. But while the Christians and Muslims shared the prosperity of the Mediterranean markets, the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade routes were completely dominated by the Ayyubids, making them without a doubt the most prosperous economy on their side of the hemisphere. Due to his acts of kindness and generosity, even to his enemies, Saladin would be remembered in Europe as a prime example of a chivalrous knight and benevolent leader. Saladin's character would appear in numerous European poems, plays, and novels that depicted him more as the hero than even the Crusaders he fought. In the Arab and Islamic world, Saladin is revered as a symbol of Muslim pride and Western resistance, with his image and symbology being associated with Arab nationalism and anti-imperialism. The symbol of Saladin's falcon can be seen on the flag of Egypt and on the Iraqi, Libyan, Palestinian, Yemeni, and Kurdish coat of arms. In the modern age, Saladin's struggle against the Crusaders is often seen as an analogy for the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But if anything is to be learned from Saladin's example, it's that the Arabs should focus on issues at home before they concern themselves with others. For uniting the Islamic emirs of the region is what Saladin is perhaps most famous for. Saladin's leadership in the establishment of the Ayyubid dynasty would be one of the key moments that defined the Islamic Golden Age. But the Ayyubids would not last long after his death, and with the burning of Baghdad happening just 65 years after, the Islamic Golden Age would also suffer the same fate. Or would it? Next episode, we explore the Islamic world after the sacking of Baghdad, seeing how the Islamic Golden Age would continue to persist for hundreds of years, despite the traditional narrative. We will visit the other great Islamic urban centers and meet the figures who continue to make Muslim empires the most advanced, powerful, and wealthiest nations of their day, while also introducing the true culprit of Islamic civilization's eventual decline.